I want to start with a clip from Thomas Frank. And a lot of this is going to be a Labor Day theme, which I'm renaming now Oligarchy Day. This is Thomas Frank talking about his book, Listen Liberal, and the origins of how we started shifting away from labor to basically a winner-take-all society. And shocker, the shift away from labor to the professional class, to the managerial class, to a bought-off political system, had a big part in that was the Democratic Party now telling you, vote blue no matter who. Here we go.
So what the thesis of Listen Liberal, what I write about in Listen Liberal is how the Democratic Party changed from being a party that really cared about blue-collar workers, working class people, to being a party that cares about a very different group.
Did it actually care? And even Roosevelt, when he originally ran, he certainly wasn't running on a stimulus plan. He wasn't running on a big jobs program.
Did they genuinely care?
Well, let me just add one point to it. Are they simply more farsighted when it comes to systemic solutions? Like Roosevelt knew that if you want to keep any form of modern democratic capitalism,
it has to be reformed.
You need to have a jobs program and such, or you're going to be dealing with some kind of fascism in the United States.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's exactly right. But towards the sort of end of the New Deal era, like in the 1960s, labor unions were very powerful within the Democratic Party. Members of Congress often came from a blue-collar background, came up through organized labor. That sort of thing was fairly common in those days. This is not to say that they were ever a perfect party or anything like that, but there has been a real shift, not a cosmetic shift, but a real shift.
Doesn't that actually begin with Truman?
With Truman.
Yeah, like Vice President Wallace, Roosevelt's vice president.
Oh, no, you're right. There's
been
a
real
fights.
Progressive,
Sure,
and then you have kind of a coup against Wallace.
Yeah.
The unions want Wallace as to become the vice presidential nominee.
Yeah.
And in '45, it's kind of a coup within the party, and they dump Wallace and bring in Truman.
I know, but I considered that that stuff was too far outside of the focus of Listen Liberal. I started in the late 1960s, which is, there was an enormous change in the Democratic Party. A lot of it for the better. This is in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, when the Democratic Party decided to sit down and reform itself. And they basically decided to remove organized labor from its structural position within the Democratic Party. This is the famous McGovern Commission in the early 1970s. Now, some of the things they did were very good and very healthy. And in their defense, I mean, by the way, once they do this, once a party of the left, which is unfortunately what the Democrats are in our system, once a party of the left decides that it's no longer going to be a voice of working class people and instead is going to be a voice of a different group, namely affluent white-collar professionals, which is what they deliberately chose in the early 1970s. They chose to make this transition. When that happens, things like the inequality, the situation that we're in today, are inevitable.
So that was Thomas Frank describing what his book is about, Listen Liberal, which I would very much recommend you. Credit to The Real News. He was doing an interview with The Real News, which is a great progressive channel, independent media. So what I wanted to set it up with that is to then play you a part of Bernie Sanders. If you have any sleeping issues, I've done this before. A part of Bernie Sanders' now infamous 2010 filibuster, which I think is instructive to the Democratic Party shift. So Thomas Frank is talking about the Democratic Party's shift in 1970. Really, if you know political history, a really wrong reaction to George McGovern's defeat to Richard Nixon. So the Democratic Party said, oh, well, a progressive populist candidate got crushed by Richard Nixon, so we have to totally abandon our New Deal roots, which have created a mostly equitable society. Not for black people, let's be clear, but for white people, a mostly equitable society in terms of income. CEOs made maybe 15, 20 times a worker. Well, let's fast forward Bernie Sanders in 2010. This was just part of his 8-hour filibuster.
As part of the Republican agenda, they want to expand and it's not only Republicans here, I must say, some Democrats as well. They want to expand our disastrous trade policies so that large companies in this country can continue their efforts to outsource American jobs to China and other low-wage countries. I think any objective analysis of our trade policies have shown that it has been a grotesque failure for ordinary Americans. Hard to calculate exactly, but I think it is fair to say that we have lost millions of decent-paying jobs. During the Bush years alone, some 48,000 factories in this country shut down. We went from 19 million manufacturing jobs to 12 million manufacturing jobs. And in this country, historically, manufacturing jobs were the backbone of the working class of this country. That's how people made it into the middle class. That's how they had decent health care benefits, decent pensions. And every day, we're seeing those jobs disappear because corporate America would prefer to do business in China or other low-wage countries. I returned from a trip to Vietnam last year, beautiful country. People there work for 25, 30 cents an hour. Sometimes when you go to a store, you may see a shirt made in Bangladesh. That shirt, in all likelihood, is made by a young girl who came in from the countryside into the city, one of the factories there. Now, the good news is that in Bangladesh, the minimum wage a number of months ago was doubled. Minimum wage in Bangladesh was doubled. It went from 11 cents an hour to 23 cents an hour. Are American workers going to be able to compete against desperate people who make 23 cents an hour? So my view, and I think it reflects the views of the American people, is that of course we want to see the people of Bangladesh and the people of China do well. But they don't have to do well at the expense of the American middle class. We do not have to engage in a race to the bottom. Our goal is to bring them up, not us down. But one of the results of our disastrous trade policies is that in many instances, wages in the United States have gone down. I believe that in the coming months, you're going to see an intensification of efforts to expand unfettered free trade. I think that will be a continuation of a disastrous policy.
So that was Bernie Sanders in 2010, so almost a decade ago, speaking out against the Bush tax cuts, speaking out against the extension of the Bush tax cuts by a Democratic president, then President Obama, and giving a little history lesson on just how do we get here to this point where we keep giving tax cuts to the wealthy, where we have grotesque income inequality, which has only gotten worse in the last decade since he made that speech. Bernie talked about wages. I talk about wages a lot. If you don't know, as we celebrate Labor Day, which again should be renamed Oligarchy Day because we don't really have a labor movement in this country, yes, you're starting to see more workers striking. You're starting to see more teachers striking and having victories, thankfully. You're starting to see more communications workers striking. We've seen Verizon, now AT&T. You're starting to see people fighting back, which the oligarchy and their allies in corporate media, they want to make workers feel the fight has been lost and will never be won, so why bother holding up your signs? Why bother walking out? This is the way it is and is going to be. That is the mentality they want you to have because of charts like this. I mean, chart kind of tells itself, doesn't it? Look at the productivity skyrocket for American workers since basically the 1970s. I mean, that starts all the way in the 1950s, but look at still, wages were going up a little bit 1970 to 1980. 1980, this is only through 2010. I don't have an update all the way now. This is 2010. That is not, just something that happened. That is a bank robbery. This is an intentional theft of your labor where the wages are not going to you. The wages are going to the vultures exploiting your labor on Labor Day. That's where all that productivity went, that red line. That is where the productivity is going. But in the corporate media, that's not a topic for discussion, because the corporate media, as status quo always tells you, the corporate media exists to not cover this in front of you, to cover it up. That's what the corporate media's job is, to cover up these issues. And the corporate media has helped keep that in place by not covering it, by making it seem like America, all you got to do is dream big and work hard and you'll get ahead. No, the corporate media is complicit in this. And frankly, when you have pretty much members of the top 1 to 10% seizing the means of information in this country, well, no shock, you're going to get information, branding, and messaging from the top 1 to 10%, not the rest of us. And I think this is shown in a recent study, and all of this is going to make sense. I'm doing a bit of a build-up till I get to the latest with Bernie's campaign. Look at this. CEO compensation has grown 940%. 940% since 1978. There's something very wrong here, folks. 940% since 1978. From this study, the increased focus on growing inequality has led to an increased focus on CEO pay. Corporate boards running America's largest public firms are giving top executives outside compensation packages. Average pay of CEOs at the top 350 firms in 2018 was $17.2 million, or 14 million using a more conservative measure. Stock options make up a big part of CEO pay packages, and the conservative measure values the options when granted versus when cashed in or realized. CEO compensation is very high relative to typical worker compensation by a ratio of 278 to 1 or 221 to 1. In contrast to the CEO to typical worker compensation ratio was 20 to 1 in 1965 and 58 to 1 in 1989. CEOs are even making a lot more, about 5 times as much as other earners in the top 0.1%. From 1978 to 2018, CEO compensation grew by 1,007.5%, 940% under the options realized measure, far outstripping S&P stock market growth and the wage growth of very high earners. In contrast, wages for the typical workers grew by just 11.9%. That's also known as the booming economy. The booming economy. One where the pay of CEOs has risen 940% in 3 decades. Nothing wrong with that. It's obscene. Absolutely obscene what is going on in this country. The theft and the dishonesty that our media perpetrates to defend that theft. Oh, oh my God, Bernie Sanders criticizes the Washington Post. Jeff Bezos is a patriot. Jeff Bezos and his ilk are the reason America is that shining city on top of a hill. He creates so many jobs for so many wonderful people, and people like him. How dare Bernie Sanders say there's gambling at this establishment? So I've now set up to you. And by the way, I could give you a gazillion illustrations. Here's just one. Lowe's spent billions on share buybacks, zero on severance for laid off workers. This was recent. Lowe's roughly 300,000 employees are without question the home improvement chain's greatest asset, according to their boss. He offered the shout out at the retailer's annual shareholders meetings in May, crediting a 15% boost in the company's quarterly dividends to his workers' efforts. Yet, when thousands of those workers recently got the boot, they received no notice and no severance. Instead, Lowe's, a profitable company that spent billions buying back its own stock, offered the equivalent of 2 weeks transition to pay full-time workers, some with the company more than a decade. Laid-off workers were also invited to reapply for jobs at Lowe's, though not necessarily for the same pay. Oh, wow. How kind. No notice. No severance. You know, what Lowe's just did there, if you ever watched The Hunger Games, is the equivalent of, chopping off one of the participants' heads in the Hunger Games. And then, when they have the celebration, that scene, they put up the head and be like, we wouldn't have this event without this fine head that we've chopped off. Thank you for your participation. Whoever was the recent to get murdered in the Hunger Games.
Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.